In the bustling corporate offices of Sterling and Hayes Investment Group back in 1987, the polished marble floors and mahogany-paneled walls told a story of success, power, and exclusivity. But for Charles Bennett, a brilliant young financial analyst with 2 degrees from Cornell, those same halls echoed with whispers and stares that made his accomplishments feel somehow inadequate. Fresh out of his MBA program, Charles had beaten out hundreds of candidates for what seemed like a dream position at one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms. His interview scores were off the charts, and his recommendations glowed with praise, but from his very first day, something felt off. The corner office they gave him, it was actually a converted supply closet, barely big enough for a desk. His so-called executive assistant was shared with 4 other junior analysts, all of whom mysteriously had priority over his requests. And despite his expertise in emerging markets, he kept getting assigned to fetch coffee and make copies for client meetings he wasn't allowed to attend. "We just want you to learn the ropes," they'd say with thin smiles, while less qualified analysts were fast-tracked to client-facing roles. Charles wasn't naive. He knew exactly what was happening. But instead of letting their thinly veiled prejudice break his spirit, he made a decision that would change everything. Every morning, he arrived an hour before anyone else. While the cleaning crew was still making their rounds, Charles would pore over market reports, analyzing trends others had missed. During lunch breaks, when his colleagues headed to expensive restaurants, he stayed behind, building complex financial models that would prove revolutionary for the firm. Then came the Thompson account, a $50 million portfolio that every senior partner had written off as a lost cause. The client was threatening to pull their business, frustrated by years of mediocre returns. Late one evening, as Charles was organizing the filing room, another special assignment, he noticed something in their portfolio that everyone else had overlooked. Working through the night, fueled by nothing but determination and vending machine coffee, he developed a comprehensive strategy to not only save the account, but potentially double its value. The question was, would anyone even look at his proposal? Would they continue to overlook his talent simply because of the color of his skin? What Charles did next wasn't just about proving his worth. It was about challenging a system that had been designed to see him fail. As he stood outside the senior partner's meeting room the next morning, clutching his carefully prepared presentation, he knew this moment would either make or break his career. The security guard had already been called twice to verify his clearance for being on the executive floor. His palms were sweaty, but his resolve was unshakable. Just then, Mr. Thompson himself stepped off the elevator, early for the emergency meeting called to discuss pulling his account. Charles took a deep breath. He had exactly 45 seconds in that hallway to either walk away or take a chance that would transform not just his own future, but potentially the entire culture of Sterling and Hayes. What happened in those next few moments would become legendary on Wall Street, though few would believe it at first. The tension in those mahogany halls was about to reach a breaking point, and Charles Bennett was done playing by their rules. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from following the path others set for you, but from blazing your own trail, even when others are determined to see you fail. Without a moment's hesitation, Charles stepped forward and addressed Mr. Thompson directly. "Sir, I believe I have a solution that could transform your portfolio's performance." The words came out steady, despite his racing heart. Mr. Thompson, a man known for his short temper with unsolicited advice, paused and raised an eyebrow. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence in Charles's voice, or maybe it was simple curiosity, but something made the seasoned investor stop and listen. "You have exactly 2 minutes," Mr. Thompson said, checking his gold watch. The senior partners, who had just emerged from their office to greet their client, stood frozen in disbelief. Charles didn't waste a second. He pulled out his meticulously prepared charts and began explaining his strategy. He'd identified an emerging pattern in Asian markets that everyone else had overlooked, a pattern that perfectly aligned with Mr. Thompson's investment goals. His analysis was thorough, his projections conservative yet promising, and his presentation flawless. As he spoke, Mr. Thompson's expression shifted from skepticism to intrigue. The senior partners, who had initially tried to interrupt, fell silent. Charles's 2 minutes turned into 5, then 10. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the hallway as this impromptu presentation continued. But just as Charles was reaching the crucial part of his strategy, Richard Sterling IE, the firm's managing partner, attempted to cut him off. "Mr. Thompson, I apologize for this unexpected interruption. Perhaps we should proceed with our scheduled meeting." "No," Mr. Thompson interjected, his eyes still fixed on Charles's projections. "I want to hear the rest of this." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, the power dynamic in the hallway shifted palpably. What happened next would later be described as either the boldest or most reckless move in the firm's history. Charles pulled out a sealed envelope from his briefcase, his resignation letter. "Sir," he addressed Mr. Thompson, "I believe in this strategy so much that I'm willing to stake my career on it. If my projections don't hit their targets within 6 months, I'll resign from finance altogether." The senior partners exchanged nervous glances. They knew that if Charles succeeded, their deliberate attempts to sideline him would be exposed. If he failed, they'd lose their biggest client anyway. They had underestimated him, assuming he would eventually quit under the pressure of their subtle harassment. Mr. Thompson studied Charles's face intently, then looked down at the detailed analysis in his hands. The young analyst had identified opportunities that his highly paid investment team had missed for years. But more than that, he saw something in Charles that reminded him of himself 40 years ago, raw talent mixed with unwavering determination. The next words out of Mr. Thompson's mouth would send shockwaves through the entire firm. The senior partners' faces turned ashen as their client began to speak. Charles stood his ground, knowing that everything he had worked for, every sleepless night, every subtle slight he'd endured, had led to this moment. But before Mr. Thompson could finish his sentence, an urgent message from the trading floor interrupted them. The Asian markets had just opened, and something unprecedented was happening, something that would make Charles's strategy even more crucial than anyone could have anticipated. The tension in the hallway reached fever pitch. The next few minutes would either vindicate Charles's brilliance or confirm the biases that had held him back. Either way, Sterling and Hayes would never be the same. The urgent message from the trading floor was just the beginning. Asian markets were experiencing unprecedented volatility, exactly the kind of market condition Charles had predicted in his analysis. The Nikkei had dropped 7% in the first hour of trading, sending shockwaves through global markets. Most investors were panicking, but Charles remained surprisingly calm. "This is the opportunity," he said, pointing to his projections. "Everything that's happening right now. I forecasted this 3 months ago in these reports." He pulled out additional documents from his briefcase, showing detailed predictions that matched the current market conditions with uncanny accuracy. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened as he compared the real-time market data on his pager with Charles's projections. The senior partners huddled together, whispering frantically among themselves. They had dismissed these same reports when Charles had tried to submit them through proper channels weeks ago. "Sir," Charles continued, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them, "what's happening now is just the first wave. Based on my analysis, we have exactly 47 minutes to reposition your portfolio before the European markets react. If we move now, we can not only protect your current investments but potentially triple their value. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Charles was wrong, Mr. Thompson stood to lose millions. If he was right, it would be the most profitable single-day trade in the firm's history." The senior partners watched in horror as their biggest client pulled out his phone. "Get me full trading authority for my account," Mr. Thompson barked into his phone. "And I want this young man to have direct access to execute trades." Richard Sterling I stepped forward to protest, but Mr. Thompson silenced him with a stern look. "Either he gets full access, or I pull my entire portfolio. Right now." The next 40 minutes were a blur of activity. Charles was finally granted access to the trading terminal, the same one he had been told was too complex for him to handle just days before. His fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a series of precisely timed trades that seemed erratic to observers, but followed a carefully orchestrated plan. The senior partners paced nervously, watching as Charles moved tens of millions of dollars through various markets and instruments. Some of them tried to intervene, claiming his strategy was too risky, but Mr. Thompson waved them away. "Let him work," he commanded. With just 5 minutes left before the European markets opened, Charles made his final move, a massive position that would either vindicate his entire strategy or destroy his career in spectacular fashion. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the trading terminal. As the clock struck the hour, all eyes turned to the monitors. The European markets were about to open, and the first trades would either trigger a cascade of profits or losses. Charles stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the numbers scrolling across the screen. Everything he had endured, every obstacle they had placed in his path, had prepared him for this moment. The first trades started coming in, and Mr. Thompson leaned forward, gripping the back of Charles's chair. The senior partners held their breath. What happened in the next few seconds would either expose their discriminatory practices or give them the excuse they'd been waiting for to dismiss Charles once and for all. The monitors suddenly flashed red, then green, then red again. A gasp filled the room as the numbers began to move at a dizzying pace. The trading room erupted in chaos as the numbers stabilized. Charles's initial trades were showing a stunning 40% return in just minutes. Mr. Thompson's portfolio wasn't just surviving the market crash, it was thriving. But before anyone could celebrate, an unexpected alert flashed across the screen. Someone was attempting to reverse Charles's trades from a terminal on the 32nd floor. "What's happening?" Mr. Thompson demanded, his face reddening with anger. Charles's fingers flew across the keyboard, fighting to protect the positions he'd carefully built. That's when he noticed something even more disturbing. These weren't random counteractions. Someone was using insider knowledge of his strategy to systematically dismantle it. "Lock down all trading access," Charles commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. The tech team scrambled to respond, but the damage was already spreading. Millions of dollars hung in the balance as a hidden adversary worked to undermine everything Charles had built. Security footage revealed the shocking truth. Richard Sterling IE's son, Thomas, was frantically working at a private terminal, attempting to force Charles' strategy to fail. The same Thomas Sterling who had accidentally spilled coffee on Charles' original market analysis reports last month. The same person who had been given the corner office that should have been Charles. But Thomas had made one critical mistake. In his desperate attempt to reverse Charles's trades, he had inadvertently exposed years of questionable trading practices. His own terminal history showed a pattern of suspicious activities that had somehow evaded the firm's compliance department. Mr. Thompson watched the scene unfold with growing fury. "Stop all access to the Sterling terminals immediately," he ordered. The senior partners protested, but their objections fell on deaf ears. As security officers escorted Thomas from the building, Charles remained focused on the screens, his mind already calculating how to turn even this sabotage attempt to their advantage. "They're pushing everything toward the European bonds," Charles explained, his voice steady despite the tension. "But they didn't notice the secondary position I built as a safeguard." A slight smile crossed his face as he pressed a final sequence of keys. Sometimes the best defense is hidden in plain sight. The monitors suddenly shifted again, but this time the numbers told a different story. Charles hadn't just anticipated market volatility. He had prepared for internal sabotage. Every attempted reversal by Thomas had triggered a secondary set of trades, turning the very attacks meant to destroy Charles's strategy into additional profit opportunities. Mr. Thompson's expression transformed from concern to amazement as he watched the portfolio value climb even higher. But before he could speak, the firm's compliance officer burst into the room, clutching a stack of documents. What she had discovered in the Sterling family's trading records would shake the foundation of Wall Street itself. The senior partners grew pale as she began to speak. Charles's strategy hadn't just exposed market inefficiencies. It had inadvertently uncovered something much bigger, something that powerful people had spent years hiding. As federal regulators began arriving at the building, it became clear that this was no longer just about proving Charles's abilities. The young analyst who they had tried to humiliate now held not just Mr. Thompson's portfolio in his hands, but potentially the fate of the entire firm. As elevators filled with SEC agents reached their floor, Charles faced a decision that would define not just his career, but his character. As SEC agents filled the trading floor, Charles remained focused on the screens, his strategy still unfolding perfectly despite the chaos around him. The compliance officer's documents revealed a decade-long pattern of discriminatory practices masked by fraudulent trading records. The Sterling family hadn't just tried to humiliate Charles. They'd been using similar tactics to push out talented minority traders for years, all while covering up their own illegal trading activities. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Before anyone says another word, I want to make something clear," he announced. "As of this moment, I'm not just keeping my portfolio with this firm. I'm increasing it, on one condition." He turned to Charles. "I want him running it." The senior partners began to protest, but Mr. Thompson silenced them with a wave of his hand. "And one more thing. I'm buying a controlling stake in Sterling and Hayes. First order of business." He paused, looking directly at Charles. "We're renaming it Thompson and Bennett Investment Group." But Charles raised his hand, surprising everyone. "With all due respect, sir, I have a different proposal." He pulled up a final set of projections on the screen. "The firm shouldn't be about any individual's name. What if we created something new? A firm that actually delivers on the promise of equal opportunity." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. As federal agents combed through records and the Sterling family faced the consequences of their actions, Charles presented his vision. He hadn't just developed a brilliant trading strategy. He created a completely new investment model, one that would open doors for talented analysts from all backgrounds. Horizon Global Partners, Charles suggested, revealing a complete business plan he developed during all those late nights in the converted supply closet. A firm where performance and integrity matter more than privilege and prejudice. Mr. Thompson's face broke into a broad smile. "Even better than I imagined," he said. "You weren't just fighting for a position. You were planning to change the whole game." But just as the papers were being drawn up, Charles's computer pinged with an urgent alert. His trading algorithm had detected something strange in the global markets, a pattern that seemed impossibly familiar. He zoomed in on the data, his eyes widening in realization. "The Sterlings weren't working alone," he announced, pointing to the correlations on his screen. "This goes beyond one firm. It's a network of companies, all using the same discriminatory practices to maintain control. And thanks to today's trades," he paused, allowing himself a small smile, "we now have proof." Mr. Thompson leaned in, studying the data. "How long have you known about this?" "Since my first week here," Charles replied. "Every time they pushed me aside, I wasn't just doing their busy work, I was gathering evidence. Today's trades weren't just about making money, they were about exposing the truth." The SEC agents exchanged glances and immediately got on their phones. Within hours, what started as an investigation into one firm had expanded into one of the largest financial probes in Wall Street history. 3 months later, Charles stood at the podium of the newly launched Horizon Global Partners, now the fastest-growing investment firm in the country. The converted supply closet had been transformed into a training center for underprivileged youth interested in finance. But his greatest satisfaction came from something else, the wave of reform sweeping through Wall Street as firm after firm rushed to change their practices in the wake of the Sterling scandal. "Sometimes," he told the eager young faces in the crowd, "the best way to break down barriers isn't to just climb over them. It's to build something so much better that those barriers become irrelevant." The applause that followed wasn't just for his success, it was for the doors that would never again be closed to talent, regardless of its color. 5 years after that fateful morning, Horizon Global Partners had become more than just a success story. It had become a blueprint for change. Charles's investment strategy had yielded consistent returns that outperformed traditional firms, proving that diversity wasn't just about fairness, it was about finding hidden opportunities that others missed. The old Sterling and Hayes building had been completely transformed. The mahogany panels were replaced with glass walls, symbolizing the transparency that was now at the heart of the firm's operations. The former executive floor, once an exclusive domain, now hosted a bustling innovation center where analysts from all backgrounds collaborated on new investment strategies. Mr. Thompson, who had remained a key advisor, often reminisced about that dramatic day. "You know what impressed me most?" he would tell visitors. "It wasn't just the brilliant trading strategy. It was that Charles chose to use his moment of triumph to lift others up rather than simply claiming his own spot at the top." The training program Charles had started in the old supply closet had grown into a full-scale academy, providing opportunities for hundreds of promising students from underserved communities. Many of its graduates now held key positions at top firms across Wall Street, each one carrying forward the lessons they'd learned about integrity, perseverance, and real leadership. The Sterling scandal had indeed triggered a wave of reforms throughout the financial industry, but more importantly, it had sparked a deeper conversation about how talent and opportunity intersect. Firms that had once hidden behind tradition began actively seeking out diverse perspectives, finding that their performance improved as their cultures changed. Charles himself had changed, too. The quiet determination that had sustained him through those challenging early days had evolved into a calm confidence. He still arrived early each morning, but now it was to mentor young analysts who reminded him of himself. "Success isn't just about proving others wrong," he would tell them. "It's about proving yourself right." The converted supply closet remained untouched, a reminder of where it all began. Next to its door hung a simple plaque: "Talent can bloom anywhere, if given light and space to grow." It had become a tradition for new hires to spend their first day working from that tiny office, experiencing firsthand the journey that had sparked an industry-wide transformation. One morning, as Charles was showing a group of students around the trading floor, a young woman raised her hand. "Weren't you afraid," she asked, "when you stood up to them that day when everything was on the line?" Charles paused, considering her question carefully. "Fear isn't the opposite of courage," he replied. "Sometimes, courage is about being afraid but recognizing that something matters more than your fear. For me, it wasn't just about proving my worth. It was about making sure nobody else would have to prove theirs the same way." Looking out over the trading floor, where analysts of every background worked side by side, Charles smiled. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls, casting no shadows. In the spot where he had once stood alone, clutching his presentation while security questioned his presence, a diverse group of young traders huddled around a screen, excitedly discussing a new market opportunity. "The real victory," he told the students, "isn't in the changes you can see, though those matter. It's in the changes you can't see. It's in the opportunities that are no longer denied, the talents that are no longer overlooked, and the dreams that are no longer deferred." As the students nodded, taking in his words, Charles caught his reflection in the glass walls. The young analyst who had once been given a supply closet for an office was gone. In his place stood someone who had done more than just succeed. He had opened the door for others to follow, and that, he realized, was the greatest success of all.